everybody, to our Fall 2020 Friday Forum series. I'm so happy you're here. I have been really excited every week by the topics that have come up, by the speakers who have engaged us. We're really grateful. And so during an election year, and if you've tuned in every week, you've heard me say this, but during an election year, we wanted to kind of zoom out and think about broadly the state of our democracy. How are people thinking about the forces that shape our democracy? And so we're really grateful for Dr. Sotirovic talking specifically about how the media is one of those forces that shapes the way we think about this country and relate to each other. And so yeah, and I'm going to thank our sponsors because without them, this series wouldn't be possible. So shout out to the Center for Advanced Studies, the Department of Journalism, Department of Religion, Educational Policy Organization and Leadership, the Humanities Research Institute, LGBTQ Resource Center, the McKinley Foundation, the Office of the Provost, the School of Social Work, the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Champaign-Urbana, the Urbana-Champaign Friends Meeting, Women in Gender and Global Perspectives Program, and the First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana. Thank you so much to everyone who made this series possible. We're very grateful to you. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Sotirovic. So Mira Sotirovic holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an accomplished scholar in propaganda, media effects, and public policy. She is a Karin and Folke Dovring scholar in propaganda in the Department of Journalism. She studies news media effects on people's understanding and perception of social issues and the support for social policies these perceptions engender. Her articles have appeared in top journals of the field and edited volumes such as the Oxford Encyclopedia of Journalism Studies and the Sage Handbook of Propaganda. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much too. Hi everyone, and I would like to thank first to YMCA Friday Forum for inviting me to speak. And I'm honored to present because Friday Forum is one of my favorite speech series. And I send my reporting students to cover Friday Forum speeches every time when I teach reporting, and it is one of their assignments that I enjoy reading the most. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I'm going to share my slides now with you and start my presentation. Okay, so Michelle, does it look all right? Great. Okay, so let me tell you what I'm going to talk about today, a short overview. So the focus of my talk is the news media. And I'll start by showing you what the news media are telling us about the state of democracy these days. Second, I'll talk about the importance of factual and accurate information for democracy and journalism. Third, I'll tell you about the famous study of the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution called A Test of the News. Fourth, I'll show you what people think about the news media today. Fifth, I'll point out some contradictions of journalism that may lead to weaknesses in the coverage. And at the end, I'll talk about how those contradictions and tensions can make finding and reporting truth difficult. So the title of this series is The State of Democracy, and I thought that the most democratic way to determine that is to ask you, what is the state of American democracy? So here are three statements, and I wonder if you agree or disagree with them. So I'll read this. I fear that we are witnessing the end of American democracy. A second Trump term might injure the democratic experiment beyond recovery. Donald Trump just told us our democracy is at risk from him. Well, if you agreed with all of them, I know where you get your news these days. These statements are the recent headlines from the New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN. There are huge differences on which news media people rely on to get news about politics. The chart above shows that most Americans get news from Fox News, And during the last summer, it was the highest rated news channel. For example, more than 4 million people tuned to ESPN on July 23rd to watch the baseball opener, but Hannity was still the most watched program on television that night with 4.3 million viewers. The Fox News is the most watched news channel, followed by CNN. But you should know that Fox News top ranking is due to its popularity among Republicans. 60% of Republicans watch Fox News, whereas Democrats are spread among CNN, Network, and MSNBC. There are well-known psychological mechanisms such as cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning, and confirmation bias that explain why Republicans tend to watch Fox News and Democrats watch CNN or read the New York Times. We like the news that we agree with. We like and look for confirmatory information that supports what we already think. And we discount or ignore any piece of evidence that seems to support an alternate view. We also have a tendency to find messages we want to believe as more convincing or true. For many of the news organizations, these mechanisms make the core of their business model. They intentionally and primarily appeal to audiences that agree with their point of view. Because nobody wants to hear news that they don't like, these news organizations differ in terms of what they talk about and how they talk about democracy too. Actually, if editors of some of these news media outlets think that everything is fine with our democracy, this topic will not be covered at all, or it will be covered in a way to dismiss it. That said, I wonder how many of you today disagreed with the statements at the beginning. I would not expect that it's a large number. Otherwise, I think you would not be attending this speech. But there is an alternative view on the state of our democracy. And I found it in several comments to one of the Washington Post editorials on the list, the one that had a headline, "A second Trump term might injure the democratic experiment beyond recovery." I would like to show you some of those comments too. So the first one, "This editorial is the most appalling piece of crap I ever read. The lies are awful. I don't have enough time to refute all the lies it says. Talk about hate. It's obvious that Democrats cannot stand the success of his presidency. It's almost embarrassing how you trash him." The next one, "Washington Post is engaged in disinformation and baseless fear-mongering. Trump is saving democracy from what ails it, socialism and victimization identity politics. Are you kidding me? Our democratic experiment has been slowly destroyed by nearly a century of liberals and liberalism who absolutely believe that government is the answer to the galaxy's problems." And the last one, this comment was to the same Washington Post opinion piece, but the author refers to the New York Times. So it reads, "Does the New York Times offer anything but hate, distortion, and lies? I think not. And they believe, like most sane Americans, that the New York Times, the media, and the Democrat Party are an existential threat to our freedom and democracy." So I guess here, by referring to the New York Times, this comment must be just a generic response that applies to all liberal news media. Many of these opinions are reflected in what you can see on Fox News or read in Washington Examiner or Breitbart News. The point is that news sources provide Americans with different narratives of the same events. These narratives use different facts and provide different interpretations of the same facts. They influence people's opinions and behaviors. And as a result, big parts of the country live in alternative realities and believe in different truths. It seems indeed that we are living in the post-truth era. Let me just remind you about what post-truth means. Post-truth was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. It was popularized by its association with Trump and his frequent use of lies and falsities, although the word has much older origin. It was defined as circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. However, I believe that an even more fundamental problem today is that Americans have difficulty with differentiating facts from opinion, and they cannot even agree on facts. So let's talk about facts. This chart shows the results of the Pew Research Sample Survey, in which they showed Americans a series of statements that have been taken from news stories. 5 statements were judged by Pew Research to be factual statements, and 5 were opinions. So those are grouped here and here. They asked respondents whether they consider a statement to be factual or opinion, regardless of how knowledgeable they were about the topic or whether they agree or not. I'm going to give you just general findings to save time, but exact percentages are in the chart, and I'll do the same for later charts. And I actually prefer showing facts to telling stories, so that's why you're going to see a number of charts in this presentation. So, on average, 66% of Americans correctly identified factual statements. Why are those factual statements? Because they can be verified by evidence. On the other hand, 72% correctly identified opinions. So these are the factual statements, and these are the opinions. And in terms of results, we can also say, or alternatively, we can say that about 1/3 of Americans misidentify facts for opinion, and about 1/3 misidentify opinions for facts. 2 statements that seem to be easiest to identify as a fact or opinion were about where Obama was born and that abortion should be legal. You can see that in these areas here. About 80% identify these 2 correctly. The middle gray line shows the results for the whole sample for all Americans. The most difficult statements were about the immigrants' rights under the Constitution and the problem they present for the country. So that is here and here. This is particularly interesting finding because immigration was among the most often covered topics in the news about the time when these questions were asked. Still, Americans had difficulty determining what is fact and what is opinion. Even more interesting finding is that partisans are more likely to correctly identify the factual news statements when they favor their side. Almost 90% of Democrats and only about 60% of Republicans identify that Obama was born in the US as factual statements. So here again, and blue line is for Democrats and red is for Republicans. Alternatively, partisans are also more likely to reject facts and call them opinion when they disagree with them, such as in the statements, immigrants who are in the US illegally have some rights under Constitution. It's shown here. Republicans and Democrats are also more likely to incorrectly classify opinions as factual statements when they favor their side. Only half of Republicans classify opinion that immigrants who are in the US illegally are a very big problem as an opinion. There it is. About 80% of Democrats correctly classify these statements as an opinion. In other words, what this means is that we automatically see opinions we agree with as facts. The country may be experiencing a crisis in facts. We live in an era of factoids. That may not be surprised given that in political world, opinions are often intentionally disguised as facts, and facts are blurred with emotional appeals. There is no doubt that availability of accurate information is one of the necessary requirements for democracy. Modern democracy is an enlightenment project started in the age of reason and science. The project is founded on the premise that facts are a necessary condition for knowledge and truth. Facts and reason are foundations of decision-making in democratic societies. And it is not that Americans disagree. From another recent Pew Research survey, we know that a majority of Americans, almost 70%, think that agreement on facts is a very important value for the country. But for journalists, facts are sacred. The American Press Institute and the Associated Press surveys ask both members of general public and journalists how important are certain things for the news media to do. So in this chart, you have on the left-hand side how the public responded, and on the right, the percentages for journalists. And the length of the bar indicates how big the difference is between what public thinks and what journalists think. 99% of journalists said that it is extremely or very important for the news media to try to verify and get the facts right. The general public agreed. To verify and get the facts right was also what the general public thought the most important news media role is. The second in importance for journalists was to act as a watchdog of powerful institutions and people. And in the third place was to be fair to all sides. However, for public, the second in importance was to be fair to all sides, rather to act as a watchdog. And the largest discrepancy between journalists and the public was regarding acting as a watchdog. Only about half of the general public thought that it was an important role versus 93% of journalists. It is 39 percentage points gap. These roles are highly internalized among journalists, and it is important to know where these roles come from. They originate from the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, journalism defined itself as a profession in opposition to sensationalism, and also as a response to public outrage when it was revealed how complacent the press was with government's propaganda during World War I. There was a widespread and growing doubt whether Americans have access to the news about contentious affairs. The doubt ranged from accusations of unconscious bias to charges of corruption. There was a belief that the news was poisoned. Two journalists, Walter Lippmann and Charles Mertz, thought that the situation was so grave that evidence was needed, and they decided to test the news. So Lippmann and Mertz conducted the first systematic study of news content. The study was published in 1920. It analyzed 3 years of the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution from March 1917 to March 1920. Why did they decide to study the coverage of the Russian Revolution? Because of its intrinsic importance and because of passion it aroused. They thought that these two conditions most seriously tested objectivity of reporting. Their test consisted of whether the picture of various phases of the revolution that readers were given in the news matched with the actual outcomes of a number of events. There was no dispute about those outcomes. So they did not try to compare news with accounts that claimed the whole truth, real truth, or true truth about the Russian Revolution. They found that all those accounts produced contradictory evidence and they could not establish any objective criteria for truth. So what did they find? The Times assured the readers on 91 occasions that the revolutionary regime was near collapse, despite the fact that Bolsheviks were winning in Russia. But just by looking at undisputed facts, Lippmann and Mertz concluded that the coverage was vastly distorted. Why did this happen? They concluded that the Times relied on official sources, such as government and the leaders of political movements. Even more misleading than the official statements was their reliance on anonymous sources. Also, Lippmann and Mertz concluded that reporters had personal sympathies and that they lacked proper training and knowledge. In addition, they found a blatant intrusion of the editorial bias through emphasis and caption. Lippmann and Mertz issued warnings that it was the time of reckoning for journalism. They said it was time for journalism to agree on a code of honor, as the bar or medical associations did, and to watch within for infractions of that code. So let me just tell you a little bit more about Lippmann for those who are not familiar with the name. Lippmann was a journalist, a commentator, and co-founder of the New Republic magazine. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Lippmann was among first public intellectuals who recognized the centrality of news for democracy. He believed that sound public opinion cannot exist without access to accurate news, but he was also concerned with the consequences of inaccurate reporting. In his most famous and influential book, Public Opinion, published in 1922, he said that the news creates pictures inside people's heads that do not automatically correspond with the world outside. In a similar way, Lippmann pointed out that pictures inside people's heads do not automatically correspond with the world outside because the world outside is filtered through news. Lippmann also made clear that news and truth are not the same thing. He said, the function of news is to signalize an event. The function of truth is to bring to light the hidden facts, to set them in relation with each other and make a picture of reality on which man can act. Only at those points where social conditions take recognizable and measurable shape do the body of truth and the body of news coincide. He believed that the best journalists can do is to admit their limitation in accessing truth and to demand more usable information. So in general, our access to truth is limited. Here is the simplest illustration of our difficulty in accessing truth. The question of whether this is a rabbit or a duck depends on where you place your attention. Well, this works for most people. They can see both. Here is another simple illustration how our access to truth may be limited and dependent on context. The orange circles are of the same size, of course. It seems that the circles are of different size, but the truth is entirely different. Do you believe me? Well, you do not have to, we can measure it. But in the social world, where many times there is no objective standard, the discrepancy between what we perceive and what the truth may be is much greater and harder to establish. What can we do in the social world when there are no objective measurements? One of the best ways of perceiving events and issues more objectively and accurately is to explain why something opposite might be true. Unfortunately, explaining and presenting opposite points of view is not what we find in a typical news story. But let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century crisis in journalism and how it led to what we see today as the main roles of journalism. So 3 years after Lippmann and Meretz called for a code of honor, in 1923, several editors of prominent American newspapers published the first code of ethics, or canons of journalism, for the newly established organization called American Society of Newspaper Editors. Their intention was to codify sound practices and just aspirations of American journalism so that journalism becomes a true profession. One of the principles was truth and accuracy. In the explanation of the principle, the statement says, good faith with the reader is the foundation of good journalism. Every effort must be made to assure that the news content is accurate, free from bias, and in context, and that all sides are presented fairly. Every journalist, or at least my students, knows this by heart. So where are we now, almost 100 years later? Did the news media earn good faith with the audience? So let's see what Americans think about the news media today. Here are some facts from 2020 Gallup Knight Foundation survey. The survey found that most Americans have unfavorable opinion of news media. Most Americans think that the news media are supporting our democracy poorly. However, despite this harsh evaluation of the news media performance, a large majority of Americans think that the news media are critical or very important to democracy. Americans agree that media have important roles, such as making sure Americans have the knowledge they need to be informed about public affairs and reflecting the diversity of the US population. You can see this big disparity between recognizing the importance of news media and hating them. Why? We can get a hint by looking at what drives the negative evaluation of media performance. So who are the people with particularly unfavorable opinion on the news media today? So looking at the orange lines that show percentages of those who have unfavorable opinion within various groups, they are Republicans. About 70% of Republicans versus only about 20% of Democrats have unfavorable opinion. But also unfavorable opinion dominates among whites, men, and younger Americans. It's also interesting that independents are closer to Republicans, 17 points difference than to Democrats, 32 points difference. In other words, they seem to be more aligned with the Republican view. The bottom line here is that the whole story of American attitudes toward news media, such as trust, confidence, bias, accuracy, it cannot be told without partisanship. Well, we are talking about negative use of the news media. What do Americans think are the major problems with the news coverage? Overall, online misinformation leads Americans' top concerns with media today. The largest percentage of Americans say that the spread of inaccurate information on the internet is a major problem. And in an extraordinary and rare moment of agreement on something, Republicans and Democrats are unified in this opinion. I don't think that this is inherently the news media problem, and it is interesting that Pew included this question in this index. But this result suggests that the news media should be rethinking their reliance on the social media for information. This reliance, as well as their presence on the social media platforms, where their information is mixed with all kinds of rumors and misinformation, may be very problematic and damaging at the end. Other major concerns are related to various forms of media bias, inaccuracy, and sensationalism. This chart emphasizes the partisan differences. So looking from the top of the chart, you can see that the largest gaps between Democrats and Republicans is with accuracy and bias. Both majorities of Republicans and Democrats think that there is too much bias in the reporting of news stories, although there are 30 percentage points more Republicans than Democrats. The 30 points gap is also on accuracy, but here we have a minority of Democrats, 40%, and who think that reporting is inaccurate versus 70% of Republicans. So that is here. So here it is again, the central problem of our democracy today. We disagree on what is accurate, or we do not agree on the basic facts. We live in the alternative realities or factoids. Is this something new? When did we start to disagree on facts? If you look over time, the watershed moment of divergence between Republicans and Democrats regarding accuracy and bias in the news media was the controversial presidential election of 2000. And the distrust and vitriol continued about the same level ever since. So this is where it started. With political bias, the chart on the right, you can see that in 1995, Americans were equally divided between those who thought that the news media favor one political party over another and those who thought that they favor neither. In 2000, the gap opened, and there were about 10% more of those who thought that the news media favor one political party. Do you guess which one? And by 2017, the gap increased to almost 40 percentage points. Again, this gap is driven by the Republican negative attitudes toward the media. The story of the news media partisan bias and lack of accuracy over time also suggests that the main source of attitudes toward the news media is continued and increasing polarization between the two parties. So far, it's clear that public attitudes toward the news media reflect to a large degree partisan biases. They are not the indication of real or inherent biases, but that does not mean that there are no real or inherent problems in the news media content. However, those problems are rarely reducible to accuracy. They have more to do with the truth. Now I'll talk about some contradictions of journalism that may lead to weaknesses in the coverage and difficulty of reaching the truth. But before I talk about contradictions, I want to make clear that I believe that the news media are essential for our democracy. They provide a wide variety of information, and everybody who wants to be informed can find information they want and need and more. The best journalism uncovers wrongs, explains events, helps us understand how things work, and I admire many journalists. Truth in journalism is often compromised by the number of tensions through which professional journalism developed. The first one is between its special role in a democratic society derived from the constitutional guarantees of freedom of the press and being a profitable business that often devalues journalistic work in public interest. As in another business, as in any other business, quality journalism costs money, and the news media industry in many sectors still struggles with their business model, meaning where the money comes from. About 2/3 of the money is typically coming from advertising and about a quarter from audiences, meaning people paying subscriptions. In most news sectors, and particularly in newspapers, advertising revenues have been declining for the last 20 years, and the newsrooms were shrinking. To live, the news media must attract advertising. And today it's all about link clicks, about total site or page visits, likes, shares, comments, and so on. And clicks are generated by clickbait headlines, partisan appeals, scandals, and human interest stories. The second tension is the requirement of independence, an actual daily dependence on official or private sources for information. Journalists operate in the political world. That is the world that has been always known for spinning stories, twisting data, and lying. However, journalists depend on the friendliness with politicians and their PRs to score a scoop, to be granted an exclusive interview. In that world, claims of truth by journalists and others are always suspicious because the truth is in large measure subjective, judgmental, a mental illusion, similar to optical illusions that I showed you at the beginning. The third tension is between the profession guided with principles of truth and accuracy and its everyday function as a craft of compelling storytelling. Mark Twain said, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." And journalism, as a profitable business, never lets the truth stand in the way of a bestseller. More recently, under public pressure and viciously attacked, journalism took cover behind facts, and like in the game of mirroring, and turned to fact-checking of others. Is fact-checking an antidote to post-truth factoid era? Is it going to redeem journalism? In the recent fact-checking of the first presidential debate by the New York Times, the fact-checkers labels the candidate's statements as false, misleading, exaggerated, lacks evidence, partly true and partly exaggerated, mostly true, true. What this scale indicates is that determining the truth is hard. Between outright falsehood and obvious truth, there is a huge gray space wide open for disagreement and dismissal. Fact-checking is outside of specialized services such as PolitiFact or FactCheck, exclusively performed by news media organizations that are preferred by liberals, and conservative news media completely reject it. They put the phrase fact-checking in sarcastic quotes. They call them self-proclaimed and, of course, biased. Fact-checking also draws attention to falsehoods that get repeated a lot in a news coverage, and that repetition helps lies stick in one's brain. It's easier to believe an idea if it is more familiar, although false. A movement for revitalizing truth-seeking ideals of journalism have also recently materialized in new progress and shows launched with the promise of getting the facts right. For example, the new program News Nation that started just this September on WGN America promised news 100% absent of bias. The WGN CEO said that they were so serious about eliminating bias that they hired experts in rhetorics to review their broadcast for unconscious bias that may creep into the words they use. Actually, that is 2 experts who are reviewing broadcasts. They promise straight ahead news and also that they will let you decide how you feel about any given story. They will never tell you how to think or feel. So they say. Similar to News Nation, the new show on CNBC, the news that Shepard Smith promises truth based on no opinion, just the facts. Still, Shepard Smith said that his program will not only cover the most important stories of the day, but it will make sense of them in context and with perspective. He will tell the truth. This praising of the virtues of facts gives journalists a false sense of security. Journalists cannot hide behind facts because they decide what facts are relevant and because facts are unintelligible without interpretation and the point of view. The truth is that opinions cannot be extracted from reporting. The only question is whether and how they are hidden. And as you know, the cover-up is always more damaging. I'm afraid that these efforts by equating facts with truth are not serving public well. The truth is also that facts are necessary but not sufficient condition of truth. And it is not only the selection of relevant facts that gives reality the true meaning. Lippmann said that every newspaper, when it reaches the reader, is the result of a whole series of selection as to what items shall be printed, in what position they shall be printed, how much space each shall occupy, what emphasis each shall have. There are no objective standards here. There are conventions. It is a matter of judgment as to what will absorb the half hour's attention a certain set of readers will give to his newspaper. Those judgments and selections they demand are at the center of the 21st century reckoning in journalism. The test of news should continue, but with a different focus. Here is how a 21st century test of the news looks like. Similar to Lippmann, Pew Research content analyzed news coverage, but they did it across 24 news outlets and only during the first 100 days of the Trump administration. They did not look at accuracy or facts or truth. They looked what topics were covered and what was the emphasis in stories. What they found was that most stories about the Trump administrations were about Trump's political skills, 70%. The most covered topic after that was immigration with 14%, and then appointments and nominations, US-Russia relations, and healthcare with 9% of all stories. And there is more. Among those 5 most prominent topics covered by the news media during the first 100 days of the Trump administration, more than 2/3, 75%, focused on Trump's leadership and character rather than on his policy agenda and ideology. Immigration was the only topic in which focus was more on the president's policy agenda and ideology than his leadership and character. So you can see here 59 versus 41% of stories. What are the consequences of this kind of news media coverage? When you focus on political skills, leadership, and character, you don't cover other topics and angles. A recent survey from the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 84% of Republicans say that Trump is the candidate who is more likely to protect coverage for people with pre-existing health conditions. Actually, his policies weaken that provision, but people don't know that. They believe him based on his tweets or what he says in his rallies. It seems that the news coverage is not sufficiently counteracting what Trump says. So 100 years after Lippmann's first systematic analysis of news media content, his conclusion may still stand. The coverage is nothing short of a disaster, and it seriously misleads a whole nation, but not because the news media failed in accuracy, but because of the personalization of the coverage. In general, the media focus on individuals in power and their personalities, in this case Trump, and how they fight, rather than trying to explain the issues that they fight about and deeper consequences of those fights. This coverage emphasizes the human interest side of politics and engages audiences on the emotional level rather than asking them to think and reason about issues. It is the coverage that consists of bits and pieces of colorful quips that attract and distract public attention from policies. This is the reporting that fuels the cult of the leader. Our democracy is not about Trump. It is about conditions that led to his rise in power. And it seems that journalism still keeps on missing the real story and basks in self-serving smugness. The news media make themselves the story. Decision to cover the person rather than the real story that they are a part of may be the most harmful to truth in news. It is the problem that it is not going to be cured just by getting the facts right. The more journalism fails to admit its limitation in accessing truth, the farther from truth it is. That's all. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
If we were all in person, we would be applauding, and that would be what we're hearing. Thank you so much. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion with the time we have left. So I will encourage you all to use the Q&A function, and I will be moderating that. So we have two questions from Mark. And the first one is that given that so many Americans have difficulty in distinguishing fact from opinion, what can be done to improve the skill, perhaps through elementary, high school education? What do you recommend there?
Well, it is always obviously important to know the definition of fact and opinion, and that is where this elementary school education starts. But obviously the problem is in biases that we introduce to reality. So I think that once after we leave our formal schooling, most of the things that we learn are from the news media. And I told you when I gave some of those illustrations that the best way to actually correct the misperceptions is to explain why the opposite can be true. So basically that means that you have to explain, do a better job of explaining the public. And I think that when I gave you the scale about how the fact checkers check the statements, and that scale that looks like from truth to falsity, that there are actually huge gray areas there. Well, that's not, again, helpful for public to differentiate between facts and opinion. So the news media, again, can be more clear about, and they should stop basically insisting that somehow they're the arbiter of truth. So I think that basic honesty would help improve our understanding and knowledge and the ability to differentiate between facts and opinion.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, because I feel like I feel like as a reader, as a consumer of news and media, I am constantly bombarded by people who claim to be the arbiters of truth and the ones and specifically the ones who can give you that. So like that, but that also kind of reminds me of what you were saying about the personalization of news coverage. So it's not that we're just covering, it doesn't just become about the personalities and people that are being covered, but it's also about the journalists themselves who are doing the actual coverage.
Exactly. One of the basic rules in journalism is when you're covering stories, don't make yourself the part of the story. right? And it seems to me that the whole coverage actually of this administration violated this principle. And I think that recently, actually, Bob Woodward, in some of his interviews about the new book that he had published, that he has published about Trump, that he said that uh, uh, pomposity and this kind of self-righteousness of journalism, that is something that probably contributed to them missing the point of disruption in our politics. That was definitely 2016, right? Well, that politics continued after that, but as I said, it is important to understand why did we have that moment of disruption and what it means, rather than just focus on Trump and what he says in his tweets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have a question kind of like building off of this conversation, but I feel like when you have a medium outside of print, and forgive me because this is kind of like, I don't know, like you'll have to actually kind of draw out the question here, but like, for example, I listen to like a daily news podcast, and the person who's interviewing, like it's in all transparency, it's the New York Times, the daily podcast. And so Michael Barbaro he's like the host of the podcast. And so he is interviewing people, and we hear his voice along with the voices of people he's interviewing, other journalists, politicians, whoever it is. But it's sort of like Michael Barbaro himself takes the position of the listener, like he nods along, he says yes, so that it's like he takes the place of the person. He's in my place. Does that make sense? Like he's in place of the listener. He's the one who's kind of there for me. And so with the expansion of like different mediums of news itself, is it possible to just focus on the facts without creating these like personalities in the process?
No, it is not possible, but it is really, so I think that you're suggesting here about, again, personalizations in terms of that journalists draw attention to themselves, but there is, so that is one problem, obviously, and that is, again, probably the business model also in journalism, that they want to have the people who are going to present interesting opinions that are going to attract their audiences. But the problem is really, as I said, how they portray the politics. And this is we are talking about this during the election time. And I did not really want to make this completely just focused on election. But some of the problems that I just described here as a personalization, that is the problem also of the election coverage, and that is documented for a long time. So in terms of in the context of election, you can say that, yes, journalists do not like to focus more on images, right? They follow the people, politicians. They are just always ready to report on any gaffe that the politician makes. It is all, again, about personalities. And we know that that is the coverage that dominates really the election coverage. There is much more about that, about scandals. I mean, they're just waiting for a scandal, right? That is, but that is what they are there. And then they're covering the issue. So that is the weakness that is not new weakness in election coverage. It is called also, it is called also horse race coverage, because it focuses on winners and losers, and these are the politicians. But I was just trying to make the point that this is the broader issue. It is not only that we have election campaign 1 year before the election and everybody's talking about that, but we continue to depend on news after election. So it is very important that we understand that coverage in a broader sense, because once when the election is over, we are still going to need accurate information.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to our other questions. There's quite a few. The second one from Mark is, do people in other Western democracies have the same difficulty as Americans in distinguishing fact from opinion? Why or why not?
I don't know that. So I don't have facts here, so I cannot tell you, but it is extremely interesting question. So I don't know. But one thing that I can tell you when I introduced that word post-truth. So it was actually the word that was popularized with as I said, as a reaction to Trump's talks and basically finding that many of those things that he said were lies or falsities. But the same problem was present in Britain, for example, that about the same time they had their Brexit referendum. And it is actually, I think, for the first time, maybe it was used in the European context, the word was used. So they had also the problem they are differentiating between facts and opinion. That was the whole problem with that Brexit referendum. So I don't have the test as I presented to you from the Pew research that would apply to any other country. But as I said, I can just have this anecdotal illustration about Brexit and basically they having the same problem as we had during our 2016 election.
Mm-hmm. So maybe not a uniquely American.
Yes, yeah.
So we have a question here. How do you think journalism educators should address the problems with the practice of journalism that you highlight? Are there practitioners that you believe are good examples for your students to emulate? If so, who are they?
As I said, there are so many journalists that I admire and that I'm subscribed to their podcasts or whatever I'm getting, their newsletters or whatever they're producing. So there are many journalists and models that you can admire, but also just think about those 3 contradictions of journalism that I told you. And I think that they're really the cause of not maybe directly related to facts, because facts are the basis. There is no denying there that we cannot talk about anything before we make sure that the facts are right. So, but I'm just going back because it seems to me that, again, facts are easy in a way. And then the problem is that people basically reject them. But I don't think that that is the factuality is the main problem. We have to train, and we do train journalists. Yes, you have to verify every information. You have to check every quotes. But journalism is much more than that. As I said, there is the problem with the storytelling concept of journalism. And again, I quoted Mark Twain about that. And it is very hard to access truth when there is a limited number of ways that you can express yourself. You cannot capture the complexity of reality, really, maybe with the language or the stories that you can tell. So so the problem is really that you have to that. What are you focusing on? The main thing really of journalism is, for me, there is the selection of every step, every day, everything that journalists do every day. There is a selection of every step of their everyday practices, and you have to be aware why you're making a particular selection. Many of the selections that journalists make, they are a result of the pressures they are experiencing from their companies that they work. They know what is expected, but at least they should be aware of that. And one of the conclusions that they told you that I used at the end, as I said, they should reveal who they are. They should be more transparent about how they are creating their stories, how they are getting the information, where they're getting information. They should be more honest about that. And I think that that would be also helpful with public, maybe understanding better the whole practice of journalism. So these are the things that can be definitely improved. That it is not only about well, I'm going to get this information and publish it, and then I'm going to have the story. I think a little more thoughtfulness of why are you doing things that you're doing, that would be more helpful.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one is from Pat Simpson. Can the standard of impartiality be taken too far? How the media covered climate change for too long suggested that there was significant debate among scientists as to its reality, and this is when scientists were in fact nearly unanimous in agreeing it was happening.
Well, any social scientist is going to tell you that truth is hard. And anybody who is trained in social sciences knows that all this there are chapters and chapters in books that are devoted to something that's referred to as validity, and that is the scientific jargon for truth. And there are pages of that tell us, well, these are all the threats to the validity. But then at the end of the chapter, one thing that is interesting, it ends up always that the bottom line, it boils down that the truth is judgmental. It always depends really on what did you select to present, what did you choose, and why is it relevant, and how relevant it is to what you're seeing. So you always have to look at the truth in that way. As I said, selection, that is what is the most important thing.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and I am really interested in your answer to this. But with regard to the tensions wrought by the need to make a profit, while this problem might be overcome by approaches suggested by media analysts like Bob McChesney that involve public support for the media.
Well, yes, that would be that would help, but I don't think it's realistic. So I think that all those ideas, they sound wonderful. Yes, we should have nonprofit journalism. We should make different changes, but you cannot really have any of those changes without the major revolution, social revolution. So these are great ideas, and I think that they may change things, but I think that they are totally unrealistic. I do not see really there any kind of practical recommendation of what we can do. So, because there are extremely important structural constraints that we operate within. And those structural constraints, as I said, short of revolution, we really cannot change those things. We just have to find other ways within those that we can make journalism better.
I knew revolution would be the answer.
I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying that these are really fundamental changes that are proposed, and I don't think that anybody is ready for anything like that.
Absolutely. Do you have any closing thoughts before we go?
No, just go out and vote. So just forget about all the noise and Trump, and think about issues that are important for you, and go and vote.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, attendees, for being here and asking thoughtful questions. We really appreciate it. And yeah, enjoy your Friday. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Michelle. This was a great pleasure. Bye.
Wonderful. Bye.